Yes, thank you, Jane, and welcome everybody. It's great that we've got quite a few attendees today. It's slightly nerve-wracking, but I'm hoping that the technology stays with us and I can run through the presentation successfully. Yes, I'm giving a talk on the sustainability of conservation, with the main focus being the fact that conservation is inherently a sustainable notion. Reusing a building, looking after it against knocking it down and starting again. That's an obvious point, really. And I've got to admit, that I'm sure we'll get some questions at the end. I'm not going to profess to be the font for knowledge on all things sustainable design, nor am I going to profess to be the font for knowledge on all things conservation, which is, I'm sure, I think is great, given that you tuned in to hear me talk about conservation and sustainability. But the point is that the topics are so vast, there's so much to consider. What I'm going to try and do is do an overview of starting off conservation, then running through some sustainable design issues, and then talk about how projects that we've dealt with in the past couple of years, give you a bit of insight into those. Here we go. So this was the text that you would have seen when you signed into your Eventbrite page, claiming I'm going to talk about some project examples, which I will, how they can be a prime example of sustainable development, which I've just mentioned, absolutely they can. Careful management and adaptation of historic buildings. It is much more important in today's world of energy conservation and sustainable design. How can we utilise historic buildings to suit modern needs whilst reducing energy use? I have a slight issue with perhaps the phrase suiting modern needs and trying to adapt historic buildings to suit what we want them to do. It's worth remembering that these buildings exist and we need to try and use them as they are before we start messing around with them. I'll use the analogy perhaps of a piece of antique furniture, a dining table. You wouldn't buy an antique dining table, put it in your house, and it sits 6 people around it, and in a year's time think, actually, this table's too small. What we'll do is we'll cut it in half and make it bigger, but we can paint it all in or varnish it in, and it'll be okay, won't it? You wouldn't do that. So the same thing applies to your historic building. We need to try and use them as they are. Change does happen, change will happen. We just need to manage that change and make sure that we're doing it appropriately. So these are sort of headings that I'm going to run through, starting off with the conservation approach and philosophy. Where do we start? How do we generally approach a listed building or historic building, and what do we do with it? Climate challenge, the current climate we find ourselves in more than one sense of the word, in terms of the pressures on us to be more sustainable, to reduce our emissions. How do we do that? And who's helping us understand what we need to do? Conservation as a sustainable design decision goes back to the point I made at the start about the inherent decision of reusing a building and keeping it in use, looking after it. Then I'll run through a few case studies and some technical guidance. I'm not going to dwell too much on all the technical nuts and bolts, but I will give you some pointers of where to look, who to consult, and where you might find out some more information before we then run through a bit of a summary at the end. So the conservation approach and philosophy, excuse me. Understanding what you've got. And that's incredibly important in terms of understanding your existing building and in a sense of conservation, your listed building. I did give a presentation on behalf of Historic England a few years ago around the country to local authorities, those people who were asset managers looking after things like their libraries and their town halls that were listed. So the people who were understood how to maintain a building, but perhaps didn't understand sort of conservation consequences. And the question I posed to them was, you're all dealing with listed buildings, you might have one in mind, and you can do the same now. I'll ask you the same question. Think of a listed building that you are working on or have worked on, or one that you just know of locally. Do you know what grade listing this building is? And then the training that I gave previously, because everyone said, yes, we know, of course we know what grade listing it is, it's grade 2, grade 1, whatever. And that's great. I then said, well, do you know why it's listed? And then I got a few puzzled expressions. What do you mean why? Why is it listed? Well, what is it about the building that means that it's listed? And of course, lots of people say things like, well, it's really old, so it must be listed, yes, that's why it's important. Well, that's good. There are lots of old buildings that are listed, there are lots of old buildings that are not listed, there are lots of more modern buildings that are listed. But what is it that's significant about this building? What is it that you know? I was a bit cheeky and asked, which bit of your building is listed? And of course, the answer is that all of it's listed. If your building's listed, every element of it is listed. You've got to be careful with the whole building, not just bits. It's not just the outside. It's not just the main entrance. It's the whole thing. So to understand what you're dealing with from the outset is incredibly important. And in particular, now we go on to talking about energy efficiency and upgrading, understanding what impact your decision might have on the building. 1930s semi-detached houses. There's loads of these, they're everywhere, and they get extended and altered as these two do. These are not projects of ours, these are just images I've pilfered from the internet to talk about today. But they're, this happens, extensions, alterations, and it's all okay. This one, perhaps less successful aesthetically, but I'm sure it gives the owner plenty of floor space. And the next slide, again, could the same happen here? Could we mess around with this building and pick it about? The windows are quite nice, but ultimately we could extend it, couldn't we, in the same way that the previous one was shown to have been altered. But some of you will be waving your hands and shouting at the screen now, saying, no, maybe you can't do too much to this building. And I'm going to marvel now in my Photoshop skills in that if I go to the next slide, ta-da, the blue plaque appears, and if you can read that close enough, it says John Lennon, and of course it's John Lennon's childhood home, Mendip, I think it's called, and it is listed. Yes, it's a 1930s semi-detached property, and if it were just that version, yes, you could alter it without too much hassle and do things to it. But there's an association here with Mr. Lennon and his childhood that gives it some significance. So it's not quite as straightforward as just saying, well, it's an old building, we know we need to look after it. There are more modern buildings that are significant and are important, and we need to look after them. We need to understand what we can and can't do. Arguably, there's a chunk of work that you could do to this building without affecting the fact that John Lennon lived there. You re-roof it, well, it's still the same building. It's not, that shouldn't be a problem. But of course, there are elements that you might not want. If you find out that actually John Lennon himself made the front door, then you wouldn't want to replace the front door, that kind of thing. So we just need to understand what we're dealing with. Which leads me on to talking about significance, and this is the crux of understanding the building as far as conservation, and the NPPF may define this as the value of a heritage asset to this and future generations because of its heritage interest. The interest may be archaeological, architectural, artistic, or historic. And of course, in the case of John Lennon's childhood home, we're talking about historic association with him. It's not that it's particularly artistic or of an architectural importance. It's that other interest that gives it its significance. This is a project of ours the last couple of years. We didn't actually end up doing a huge amount, but the client wanted to know what they could do in terms of refurbishment, alterations, extensions. And this is a property that's actually split into, I think it's 3 separate dwellings. So the bit we were interested in was a bit below the sundial, the sort of 5 painted windows that you can see there. And part of the conversation was about things like thermal upgrade. What can we, can't we do? Now those 5 windows are all quite modern. They're not original windows, but they're in good condition. So why do anything to them? But there was obviously a question raised. Well, we could double glaze them. Might be okay. But the question then, from a sustainability point of view, is why are you throwing away something that actually is perfectly serviceable and does a good job? There are, as you can see in the photo, windows to the right-hand side that are different in style and different, therefore, in age, that you might want to pay more consideration to before saying, yes, we can just double glaze them. I'd be quite flippant perhaps on the next slide and say, well, of course, you wouldn't approach this property, which is just around the corner from the previous one, and say, oh, well, the windows aren't very good, we'll double glaze all the windows. Of course you wouldn't. But the point is that there are things that you can do to a medieval church, and you can upgrade and do different things. There is no, as I probably keep saying through the presentation, no one size fits all to any project. certainly not in relation to conservation and upgrading buildings such as this. So next slide is a couple of projects of ours, and again going on from understanding what you're dealing with and what you're looking at. We've got the left-hand side there is a barn conversion. It was converted back in the 1980s to a single house. It's a 17th century timber frame construction. We've got a farmhouse on the right-hand side. We believe 1690s. I'm not entirely sure, but it's a good age. And the project conversations were about alterations, upgrades, refurbishment. The key thing here is that the barn conversion on the left is grade 2 listed, but the farmhouse on the right is not listed. There's an argument perhaps it should be listed, but it isn't at the moment. And again, it's understanding what it is that you're dealing with and why that might be okay. Irrespective of that, the project discussions going forward in terms of thermal upgrades and what we were doing to it, for both the buildings, had the same conversation. You're still trying to treat this thing in the same fashion, making sure that you're not doing anything silly with adding too much insulation or altering how it performs. And the barn conversion on the inside has got details like this. So you can see some beautiful timbers in there, original timbers. The image on the left-hand side shows some of the previous alteration work, and you can actually see where the tie across there has been, the original position was a bit lower down. You can see it's been cut off. In fact, the peg is still fixed through the rafter. So it was raised up to give more better headroom. Conversation with this project was, well, can we do the same thing elsewhere at the other end of the barn and make a better space? And alter the timbers there in the centre photo. And of course, there's a question of, well, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Benefits of doing so, you can put steels in, you can do anything to make this work, but actually this decision in the end was that the building's been altered enough, and to alter it further was perhaps a step too far. So again, we were just relying on the building to do what it could do now, and we ended up putting a proposal together that just utilised the spaces as they were. There are a couple of points where you've got to dip under some beams, but that was, we accepted that, and we weren't forcing the building to do what it didn't want to do. So climate challenge, the task ahead. 10 years to save the world, 9 years to save the world, essentially. And what is it that we need to be doing, and who's helping us understand what that is. So the RIBA, many of you will be familiar with this, got their 2030 climate challenge, and this document contains plenty of information about lots of number crunching in there in terms of the targets and what we should be aiming for, water use and reduction of energy and that kind of thing. I won't go through all that in detail, but there is a point in the document that mentions existing building stock and carrying out post-occupancy evaluations, and that's a big topic at the moment as well in terms of understanding the building. And obviously, a lot of the time this is in reference to new building going up and us going back to it in a few years' time or whatever it is, and recording, is it performing how we thought it was going to? Of course, in the case of an existing building, that's where you start. What is it that's going on with your building? What have we got? What are we dealing with? And equally important is this whole life carbon assessment and understanding what actually happens at the end of this building's serviceable life. Can it be dismantled, cut into bits? In the case of historic buildings, things like use of lime mortar is a good thing because you can get rid of that quite easily and reuse the brick. If you've got a brick bedded in cement, as many people know, it's almost impossible to get that to be a usable brick again. This is another document, and you can see at the bottom left those that are involved in producing this, and it's, as you can see, net zero operational carbon for new buildings. Lots of guidance here about what to do with your new building, how to get it to meet the targets. And of course, there's nice on the bottom there, number 4, in terms of embodied carbon. Of course, with your existing building, you sort of a step ahead here. You've already got a building that exists, and whilst you can sort of go back and assess that in terms of going forward and using it, sustainable decision to say actually we can reuse something that is already there. So as a follow-up to that last slide, we've got people like this. Heritage Counts is a document produced by Historic England on behalf of the Historic Environment Forum each year, I think. You've got Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, and you've got other Historic England documents there, and all of them start to, whilst they build on and understand the need to reduce carbon emissions in new buildings, of course there's a massive, massive building stock that already exists across the country. So I've got so 2018, 5.1 million homes. That's 21% of all homes in England were over 100 years old. And the key thing here is that anything pre-1919, generally they're solid wall construction. So understanding that as a difference in modern construction is quite key, especially when you start saying, oh, we'll start dry lining it, we'll start applying insulation, and you just got to be slightly wary of how these buildings are performing. And many people, you will know, historic buildings, one of the key aspects is understanding how moisture moves through the building. Lime mortars and soft brickwork and that kind of thing will allow moisture to go backwards and forwards through the building successfully. Modern buildings tend to have that. You have your vapor control point, and you keep those things very separate. One of the points in the Heritage Counts document, though, it starts to build on, actually, you go back and start retrofitting and doing this. It said that a typical historic building of Victorian terrace, used as an example, when that is sympathetically refurbished and retrofitted, it will emit less carbon by 2050 than a new building, but only if the whole carbon of the building, whole life carbon of the building is considered. So it's very tricky. It's very difficult to say, well, you do this, that's the best thing to do. But you've got to consider everything about your projects, and certainly in the case of carbon emissions, the whole life of a building and what happens at the end of it as well is we need to bear in mind. Conservation as a sustainable design decision, as I've alluded to, we're all familiar with reduce, reuse, recycle, and recover. Repair is in there as well. As many R's as we can think of, I think, need to go into this to help guide us. But it's a key point. As I say, it's making use of an existing asset and making sure that we're not throwing away, starting again, focusing on the new. And in fact, the build mantra recently was countered with design, 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 I think. And I would suggest that perhaps there needs to be a think before design, 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 and even really understands either to make sure that we know what we're dealing with before jumping in and starting to do something that perhaps isn't what we should be doing. So certainly there's a level of understanding, but reusing and recycling existing buildings is what we certainly should be doing. And this quote you'll be familiar with as well: the greenest building is the one that already exists. Absolutely, we've got these things, we can use them. There are many listed buildings that actually help in terms of new homes. Rather oddly, old buildings are being chopped up into homes. It has to be done properly, it has to be done carefully and sensitively, but they can offer new homes to people, and we need to be considering that kind of thing as well. Most of the documents that I referred to a couple of slides ago will refer to a whole building approach. And ultimately what this means is that there is, as I said earlier, there's no one size fits all, there's no simple fix, there's nothing really that can be applied to everything. I often get asked, and there's quite a few times in the last year or so, with clients saying, can I put double glazing in my old listed building? These windows are all drafty and leaky and horrible. And the honest answer from the outset is, well, I'm not quite sure yet, because I don't know your building. I need to research your building. I need to understand the windows. What condition are the windows in? Are they about to fall out? Or actually are they okay and you can draft proof them and they'll be all right? And I get clients saying, well, there's a building down the road, that's listed, that's had double glazing in and it's all okay, isn't it? Well, it might have been for them, but it needs to be understood. And equally, is tackling the windows the starting point? Is that the best thing? Is that where your issues are? And understanding the budget. So principles of action on the right hand side of the screen there are generally things that can your considerations across the board, but of course the actual answers to these things in terms of how you go forward are going to differ depending on your project. So understanding the building, its condition, its construction, how do the owners or users use the building, how is it operated? Are there things that can just be done operationally that mean that you use less energy? Reducing your energy. These are all simple things. These are all things that apply to non-listed buildings as well. These are things that we should be considering across the board when we're talking about retrofitting and avoiding waste and what have you when you're doing this. So it's that kind of approach that we need to consider. The pre-1919 buildings, as I mentioned, this is in reference to solid wall construction and the movement of moisture and air through the building fabric. So stopping the drafts is good, allowing the moisture to move in a historic building is also good, and that's what they tend to do. New buildings obviously have different mechanisms for managing that. This is an image you might be familiar with. It's repeated in lots of historic England documents, some of the ones I mentioned earlier. And it just shows the differences between how a modern building operates and how a historic building operates in terms of controlling damp, ventilation, and obviously heat. And it's important to understand that before you charge in and start making suggestions for alterations. I mean, there are things, as we know, we're becoming more and more familiar with things that happen to listed buildings, and we all cringe when people are, this has been pointed in cement, or someone's trying to inject damp-proof course, and that just wasn't the thing to do. Just dig a French drain. The same thing then will start to apply in terms of adding insulation to buildings where it can create more problems than it solves. I'll come on to that in a moment. So as part of the Historic England document, I think this is how to improve energy efficiency publication from Historic England. It's got a quite useful section in terms of these 4 items. So understanding what you've got. So that applies both in terms of conservation and understanding why your building is listed, why is it important, as well as if it's not listed, just understanding the building, how it's performing and what it's doing, and assessing how it's currently being used. They then give a few green, amber, and red action points to say, well, what might you consider doing to your building to help improve its thermal performance? Obviously, as you go down the scale, they become a higher cost or riskier option. So you get tables like this. There are more in the document, but this is a bit of an extract. So it gives you a bit of a guide in terms of what you might want to do. So adding blinds or curtains to some windows, or draft proofing, relatively straightforward. You can move up the scale slightly and start insulating, reinstating ceilings and what have you. But there's a risk there, the impact on the building. And then you start to get up to higher risk items and obviously higher cost items. Insulating walls internally, externally. What are the decisions? How does it work? And what should you be considering? SPAB, Spam Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings, also gives some guidance on this and how you should approach looking after your building. So they've got a guide here that offers three levels. Maintain your building. Just keep on top of it. Clear the gutters out. Stop the walls getting damp. A damp wall will lose more heat than a dry wall. Breathable finishes. Consider those. Put washers on your dripping taps. Sort these little things out just to help reduce your water wastage. There's then quick wins. Draft proofing a window, putting some heavy curtains up, lagging the pipework, all these simple things. And it's quite surprising how many people will say, well, what can I do to my listed building? It's got to be something quite drastic and innovative to help upgrade the thermal performance. And actually it might be, but there are simple things that you can just do and that will help immeasurably. Do these things first before you start tinkering with anything else. But then you might get to a point where you're starting to look at more major work. upgrading boilers, changing your fuel source, reinstating render, adding the insulation at that point. And the point this fab make at the bottom there is that EPCs will often inadvertently recommend unsuitable measures for older buildings. It's, you know, quite easy to say add insulation here and there, but obviously, as I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You need to be careful about what it is that you're specifying, where you're specifying it, how thick is the insulation, what sort of insulation is it going to create a damp condensation problem? That all of that needs to be considered. And this is a case in point, actually, and I'll read this out. Even if they are identified as a source of heat leakage, the replacement of old single glazed windows that perhaps only need a little repair with new double glazed and has a short 30-year life or less in many cases is illogical. The embodied energy and lifespan of the new units negates the energy saving made while they are in service. I mean, that, again, kind of obvious. You know, you're going to go to all this expense and energy creating new windows and putting those in, but actually the saving, both in terms of carbon and energy and cost, will be outweighed by the manufacturing process. So consider actually and scrutinise your decisions at every stage. This is Historic England's guidance on potential positive and negative impacts on the building. So again, at the bottom there is a comment about the glazing we've just spoken about. If you're replacing the windows, the potential heritage impact and potential cost is much greater than if you used plasma draft proofing to the windows, and equally questionable then in terms of energy saving, carbon saving in the whole, as to whether it's going to give you what you want. There's a few graphs such as this in that document, so it's worth having a look. But it just gives you a few pointers in terms of considering the impact of the decisions that are being made and whether it's the right thing to do. This is an image from the document "There's No Place Like Old Homes," which you mentioned earlier, and just shows the potential carbon savings or reduction in emissions following a conversion, retrofit, refurbishment, and it just highlights the fact that actually so many buildings out there we're all sort of growing, oh, they're all leaky and horrible. Well, they are at the moment, a lot of them, but they can be much better and perform much better than we perhaps previously realised. And the RIBA quote there stating that 25 million homes need to be retrofitted in the next 30 years to meet our targets. Well, that's an awful lot of work. So we need to make sure that we are doing this, and certainly in the case of listed buildings, need to understand the correct way of going about it. So a few case studies now, and I put technical guidance of sorts in there from projects of ours. This is the slide I think that you'll have seen in the advert. This is the conversion of the water tower here in Dereham, in Norfolk, and obviously the sensitive addition of the new water tower to one side doesn't impact on the existing one at all. But I quite like this photo. I like this this view of the two together. It's quite good fun. This is a project that had already been given consent prior to our involvement a few years ago. That had lapsed, and we reapplied and got the new owner consent conversion of the old water tower into a single dwelling. It's across 5 stories, I think now. Not without its challenges in terms of getting the spaces to work. Obviously, you'll appreciate at the upper levels there's nothing there. Basically, you had some storage space, and you had all the pumping kits, or did have at one stage at the bottom. You had mezzanine floor levels. You had a few office rooms and some internal fireplaces that were there, sort of midway up the building. But in the top half, effectively, was clear. A very small ladder access up to the water tank itself. Of course, in the creation of a 5-story single residence, you've got to consider things like fire escape, and the rather amusing notion that we now need to potentially install a water tank, the sprinkler system, having just taken out the water tank that was there previously. It's quite good fun. And here we go. Actually, yeah. So the image on the left there is showing the the elements of the water tank that once existed coming out to make way for top floor living accommodation. The slide on the right hand side, or the grainy slide taken on my phone, is just below that floor level. So these are massive steel beams that once held up all that water in the water tank, and we're changing some floor levels to get headrooms to work and what have you. But of course, the building is there; it exists. It's what would it be otherwise? What other option could we suggest for its conversion? And residential is one of those. Obviously, taken down, as you can see on the image on the left-hand side, there's brickwork behind the old water tank there that we didn't have sight of until guys on site were taking it apart. Not in the best condition, a few upgrades needed. We had a conversation then with conservation officer about thermal performance of the solid brick wall, and at this level, right at the top, it's not terribly thick. Needs repointing and some repair work, but generally, the bricks are in okay condition. It's the water that needs sorting out, and we agreed to dry line, but with a wood fibre insulation, so it allows that moisture, and it'll be line rendered. It allows the wall to remain breathable in conservation terms, and allows the moisture to move through, so it shouldn't cause an issue there. And then looking up from that point, existing roof structure, it's a corrugated asbestos roof at the moment on the outside, just done a few years ago. That's coming off. It'll be re-tiled, slate tiles going back on, and effectively it'll be a modern warm roof above that level. The section in the middle on the left-hand side there was a filled-in lantern. It was ventilation at one point, and we're going to put a glazed lantern back up, get some light into that top floor space. And again, you can see on the right-hand image some of the brickwork. A bit of repointing needed, and again, we just need to get the insulation in the right place there. But it's all quite low key in terms of making sure we're insulating at that level. Further down, this is slightly lower on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, these are the rooms further down. We've got elements of fair-faced brick, and they're being left. We're not starting to dry line the whole building. We need the walls, as you get further down, as you can imagine, to hold up all that steel and all that water are absolutely enormous. So they're doing a reasonably good job anyway. We are looking at simply replastering, lime plaster, or lime washing where the bricks are in good condition. This then is a consideration from Historic England documents in terms of how you might have gone about dry lining. And it really references the inclusion or exclusion of a vapour control layer, which fits how things might operate. I won't go through the technical aspects of this, but you can find all this information in the publications. And what we opted for in the end, effectively, the bottom right image is putting the wood fibre insulation directly to the brickwork within a timber stud, and it will be vapour permeable. It means that the don't create or don't potentially create an issue with condensation within the initial cavity or retaining moisture at any point. So different project of ours, although ultimately didn't really become a project. Clients owned the building on the left, thatched building, listed, had been converted, as you can see there, by a modern central glazed arrangement. And the question was, crikey, we're spending lots of money on oil, what can we do? Is there something radical? Was almost the question, what can we start to consider? And ultimately, we went back to the SPAB guidance and so said, well, where are your easy wins? What are the simple things you can do? Where is it that you think you've got issues? And actually, a bit of a nosy round the building, we found that a lot of the windows, because they were relatively modern and hadn't been in that long, in a few years, had actually shrunk away. You'd got cracks and gaps forming, and nobody had been back just to fill those in. Nobody had gone back and thought, actually, we've got some shrinkages here. It's now not performing as it was. We keep turning in fact, when we went, they were adding radiators in, putting bigger radiators in because they felt they weren't getting enough heat into the property. And actually, we said, well, okay, that's fine, but you realise you've got some gaps up here and some leaky bits, and get to grips with those first. You might find you don't need then to whack your heating up even more. A lot of glazing, as you can see on that front elevation. Again, there were some ill-fitting bits and pieces in there. So we basically said, just go back and do that. Don't start to think that you need to employ some radical technique to add more insulation, dry line everything, and do that. Just review what you've got. We did send them, this is Historic England guidance again about adding insulation to thatched roofs. It effectively creates a warm roof here, but again, you're putting in permeable insulation in here. So, and it mentions wood fibre sarking boards, allowing that moisture movement. There's always a consideration of how thick is this insulation, because whilst it will allow moisture to come through, once you get too thick, it then might not, it starts to hinder that. So you then create a damp issue, especially with thatch and timber, you're going to start to create things rotting. But again, this guidance exists for this kind of installation, so do have a look if you need to. Okay. This is Kimberley Hall, just near Wymondham in Norfolk. It's grade 2 star, 1712, with some later alterations, and the wings were added. There was an earlier hall on the other side of the lake that you can see in the distance there. I've been involved for a number of years doing various bits and pieces and various small projects, and those of you that know the hall will know that it's a wedding venue. You can get married there and hold your wedding reception. One of the projects I've been involved with, it was conversion of some of the existing bedroom spaces on first and second floor into accommodation for wedding guests. So this is a project that's got the sort of dual purpose of creating jobs really, for the local population in relation to the wedding venue. It gets parts of the building back into use. Mr. Buxton still lives there with his family. Obviously, they don't live in the whole thing; it's enormous. But bits of it there's other accommodation, bits are rented out elsewhere. So getting the wedding use grown effectively really is an income generator to then look after the building. So there's a benefit there. That in itself is sustainable, where, as you appreciate, the reliance on the estate and the agricultural elements of that has reduced and continued to reduce over the years. So it's always this question of thinking of other innovative ways of utilising a heritage asset. And of course, in doing that, it in itself is a sustainable decision. It'd be quite easy to say, well, I've got a wedding venue here and you can come along, but actually I'm going to build some new accommodation around the corner. And actually what's happened here is that, well, actually I can use the hall, I can adapt it and modify it slightly, get it to work. The west wing, to the right here in the shot, is where you would have your wedding reception. It used to be a marquee in the garden. They've now got the use of former agricultural spaces here, and it's opened up use of that element. So you've got the front elevation and the main hall on the left there, and then as you swing to the right, you then look at the west wing. So the owners here have done things like upgrade the windows, draft proofing bits and pieces. There was one window that we did double glaze on the side elevation, and again, a decision there. It was a rotten window. It wasn't performing well. It needed to be replaced pretty much in its entirety. Double glaze one went back in. Very slim profile. Has been operating quite well since installation. It was for a bathroom space, so sort of double glazing was a bit of a push from to say, well, there's a thermal comfort in the bathroom. But it's an example of how this property is being reused, and certainly for the wing itself, that it's fallen out of use completely. It brings a new lease of life, which in itself is a sustainable measure. other parts of the building. Got a nice cellar, a large cellar. These are future questions. What can we do with these spaces? The centre section is the back reverse side of the west wing. It still remains in pretty poor condition in its former agricultural state. Big double doors there. It was a big grain silo in there. Still got all the chutes and things that all come through the building. And on the right hand side, odd little outbuildings. They've been, this one's been felted. Sort that out, but what can it be used for? How can it be utilised? Can it accompany the wedding venue offering be put out there as a different sort of use? And these are all considerations going forward. But again, at all times, trying to pay respect to, making sure we pay respect to the significance of the building, and making sure we don't do anything we shouldn't. And this is a nice little story. This is a new project of ours we just started to look at, but actually elements of this building, some of the floral designs and moulded brickwork that you can sort of see on the lower level there, they were reused. They were elements of part of the demolished old Kimberley Hall on the site, and they were used here. And again, this wouldn't have happened if there's not been good materials in lime mortar. They effectively pilfered some of the stuff and started to build this one over here when it all went to rack and ruin. So again, conservation is a sustainable measure. It's making sure that at the end of your building's life, you've got materials then that can be reused. This goes back to the farmhouse I mentioned earlier on. The project here was some alteration refurbishment work, not too excessive really. Potential removal of the glass house, so there's a greenhouse there, and putting a glass house on the side, potential orangery. But the smaller elements of it, slightly more detailed elements, relates to the back of the house, and the shot on the right, the door and the window and the sort of brickwork around that are all very modern. And actually that element was simply at one stage it's been a lean-to between the brickwork on the right-hand side where the external light is and the rendered section. And it's simply been filled in with a single brick, but it now forms part of a link through from the kitchen to this little outbuilding to the right-hand side. And the questions proposed, well, what can we do here? How can we upgrade it? What do we do? We want to make it warmer, better, because at the moment we've got a sort of stable door between the kitchen and this space. And on the other side of that building, you can see it's a gate effectively that divides outside and that space. So this is quite a simple one of saying we need to seal it up to a certain degree and get that space usable and make it a more internal space. But equally, what are we doing with that brick wall? Are we taking it down? Are we filling it back in with a cavity wall? Is it a timber frame that goes back in with some render? How does that work aesthetically? What are the costs associated with this? Do we keep that wall and just dry line it on one side and render it on the other? And we've sort of went round the houses a few times. The client has since gone away and started to think about this. We don't quite know which way they're going to go with it. But the review process was actually being quite careful about, we could just knock it all out and start again. But equally, how much effort is that, and can we work with what we've got? So ultimately, what I'm saying is that you need to go through that process and assess the differences. Last couple of slides now. So, case in point, actually, with regard to looking after buildings and that central, I'll go back, that central section of wall I was talking about that is a modern brick. It's in cement mortar, so it either needs to be retained or come out in its entirety. Of course, what happens to listed buildings over time can happen. Images on the left-hand side, 16, 17, 18. This is from a Historic England document as well. Good examples of repointing, lime mortar, matching in, good detailing. Against right-hand side, everyone's familiar with cringeworthy cement pointing and loss of the brickwork. The moisture all blows through and it blows the face of the brick off. And it's gone, that's it, it's lost, you've lost that brick. But we need to rely on there being people that know how to do this stuff. It's quite common that you get people that say, yes, we know how to do this building. and you get this issue with inappropriate materials, using angle grinders to cutting things, pointing out and damaging bricks and what have you. So understanding the tools that are needed, and actually from our point of view as you know, myself as a conservation architect, a reliance on people on site knowing what they're doing. You know, they need to hope that they are skilled enough and will do what we said and understand what we're doing, making sure that we don't lose these traditional skills. I think it's going to be quite a task to maintain that. It needs to be pushed more, I think, so that we don't lose that. We do have people doing the right things to these buildings. A bit of a summary just to wrap up. Understand the building. As I've said a number of times, there's no one size fits all. You've got to understand what you're dealing with, both in terms of conservation and its significance, but equally how the building's performing, appropriate choice of materials, insulation and the like. The post-occupancy evaluation assessment is obviously part of that, and then understanding the significance of what you can and can't do or should and shouldn't do to your building to improve its performance going forward. Consider those step-by-step items and target the easy wins. Don't crash in doing the big stuff first. Let's just see what we can do simplistically and focus on that. Making use of the building as it exists to suit needs. Very easy to start chopping up buildings and making them do something else. You know, we can do that, but is it appropriate? Is there a way of actually saving time, cost, energy in using the building as it is? Seek out the correct technical assistance. The publications I've mentioned, there are plenty of specialists out there that will guide you in terms of particular elements of building fabric and what you should and shouldn't do. And therefore, the next point then, traditional materials and traditional skills, and making sure that you've got the right people involved to actually execute the work that you're specifying. And finally, consider all the impacts. So there's the elements of understanding how much energy you are putting in now to upgrade a building against how much you're going to save through the rest of the building's life, but equally the impacts from a conservation point of view. Is this an appropriate thing to be doing? Is it the right thing for the building? Go back to hacking the antique dining table in half. You know, you wouldn't do that. You've got to consider what you do carefully to get the right result. Thank you very much. Click off that.
Hello.
Are you back?
I'm back. I'm back. That was fascinating. Thank you, Paul. I suppose we're going to open it up to questions for anybody, and I think that yeah, it's interesting what we were saying about every building is unique. I mean, the house that I live in was built in 1925, so it is that solid brick construction, and it's got the original sort of concrete render on the outside. And I do spend a lot of time just wondering, what are we actually going to do? You know, it does leak air a little bit, and there have been alterations to it, and you know, it's quite interesting. It got me sort of thinking a lot more about conservation, because I think as an architect, when you first taught, it's all about new buildings and new ideas, and actually we're very, very lucky to be surrounded by so many old buildings and, you know, so much heritage. And I suppose this makes me wonder, thinking in the context of this whole sort of lecture series, is that what is the architect's role? I mean, you talk about having the right people and the right skills, and I wonder whether this is a part of construction where architects sort of bring so much experience. Like, you know, my first question was, you know, where would I go to find out? You know, how do I understand my building? You know, my personal house. And I was thinking, how do you find this information? Where would I go? And maybe this is where someone like yourself and the right contractor who knows what they're doing, the right consultants, you know, they really bring that extra value that you don't end up with unsympathetic, you know, sort of conversions. And, you know, yeah, I think that's sort of like thing. Do you think this is where sort of architects and the construction profession generally, you know, really could be doing more, or do you think they do a good job? Or
Yes, I think there needs to be a bit of a coming together of all of this, and it's a number of different threads really. If you've got your existing building, your listed building, you need to do that research. So often the obvious one is, well, I'll look at the listing text, I'll see what it says there. It probably doesn't say very much at all, as most people find. I'll look in the records office, I'll do an HCR, so I'll go through all this sort of process of finding out that background to it. Great. But what we're talking about now in terms of adaptation, physical adaptation and upgrades, is more of an understanding of the building fabric, the physical construction, which I think there's more pressure on now to do that, not just in listed buildings, but obviously just existing, just retrofit campaign. So how buildings are performing and understanding that, I think what we're finding, and the RIBA have mentioned this lately, this whole, again, the post-occupancy evaluation, the architects are very good, oh, design this big building, and then off we go, and we retain the glitzy image and use it on the website, but we sort of forget to go back and say, how's it all going? Is it actually working okay for you? And how are you using it? And if you do that and you go back and have a conversation with a client, especially private, domestic clients, they'll often say, well, we had this, well, actually, we changed it now because we want it to work like this. And you realise that actually there's so many different nuances of your design that could work. And if you've been too rigid and it has to be like this, that obviously is an unsustainable thing to have done. No one else can use it there. But the materials is particularly important, I think, getting contractors in and getting those tradespeople in early. I can do a lot of reading and finding out about various bits of buildings, but equally, actually putting it together and understanding how the materials work and how to work with them is a reliance on the people on site and understanding and getting there involved.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting and really important is that the reliance and the importance of traditional, what we could be considered traditional skills, very important in the context of the climate challenge, and how do we build for the future. And the thing that stuck with me is can we work with what we've got and how can we work with it. But anyway, I've spoken too much. We do have a couple of questions. So we have a question from Andrew Smith, and he says, the idea is to let an old building breathe. With unlisted ones, how do we convince clients to adopt this and not heavily line and insulate and provide a builder's warranty? Andrew, if you are still with us, please feel free to turn your camera on and unmute yourself, and you can speak to Paul directly. But equally, if you don't want to, that's fine. Oh, here he is. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, thanks for tabling that question. Yeah, I've noted, Paul, that you have the breathable materials and the wood fibre, which we've used on listed buildings, and so therefore the role is a little bit easier. But as you know, there are so many buildings out there which are unlisted of great value, and it's very difficult to convince the client, other than being very persuasive or violent in some cases, where the best thing to do is let the building breathe and use these materials, and they insist on a sort of industry standard, where you've got a rigid installation, and straight away you're building in problems for the future. But as well as that, the client has also said to me, well, how do I get my builder's warranty for this? If we've got a new heating system, whatever it might be, and we adopt your proposal, how do I get my builder's warranty for the refurbishment works? And I've been sort of had rank pulled on me on a few occasions in this basis. Have you come across that yourself? Mostly unlisted, really.
I haven't actually, no. It's a tricky one because it all perhaps depends on what's the problem. What is it about the material choice that you're putting in? Why would a breathable material not offer the same results and the same warranty? What is it about that? Is it longevity or whatever they're concerned about? I think you're right there. The argument to push is to hit them with, but you're potentially creating a problem here by not letting it do what it wants to do. So it's understanding, picking up those documents that I've mentioned and saying, look, if you start putting your vapor control layer in the wrong place or adding too much insulation, and it will create these problems. And pushing that angle. But I have not encountered that myself, I have to admit.
It's a fair comment. It's just quite often it's understood and you put the right system in, but in other cases that those issues are not understood, and the client it will insist on going the traditional building way applied to an old building, especially if those buildings are not being perceived as well if they're not listed and not being that valuable. So I found that, you know, with conversion with ant buildings and animal buildings, that sort of thing, I think I found it more often than not, rather than something very valuable. But that's good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. We did have another question from Chris. Chris, I don't know if you're still with us, if you want to pop your camera on or ask Paul directly. But he's basically saying, Paul, have you ever got to the stage with a historic building where you could only conclude, do not resuscitate? Have you ever found one that bad?
Not in its entirety, no. I've had some clients that have suggested that, well, this building is a bit of a hindrance, and my tractor might back into it next week by accident, and I won't need to deal with it. And of course, chances are that they will need to deal with it, because they have to rebuild it exactly as it was previously. No, I think to find something that's suffering so badly as a whole, I think is quite rare. And also there are ways of dealing with buildings and taking down, rebuilding, and starting again almost. I think there's also a cost associated with that. If it's not listed, obviously you then are at the point where you go, actually, look, it has gone. You know, it's done its job for its life, and that's it. If it's listed and you've got to try and get it back into a good state, then that's what needs to be done. We had a project last year where an urgent works notice was put up. You know, it had to be repaired, and we had to take down elements of roofing and then sort of make good and leave it, knowing that at some point in the future it was going to come back into life again and become something else. This was an old barn. It might be converted, it might not. But no, I haven't come across something that has been sort of so far gone, so to speak, that couldn't be tackled.
Chris, you have a follow-up question? I can see you've unmuted yourself, so please feel free. Oh, I don't think we can hear you. Oh, that's a shame. If you've got any follow-up questions, just pop it in the chat, Chris, and I'm happy to ask on your behalf. I don't know if your volume's not working or something. We've got lots of thank yous in the chat. Someone saying, you know, this really interesting. I mean, I think I personally found it really interesting. And I think we've probably got room for another question or so, if there's anybody else. If not, I'll give you about a minute. If anybody else has got any other questions. But yeah, I think I just want to say thank you really on behalf of the NAA for offering to do this. It's conservation is not an area I work in particularly a lot, but I think what I'm sort of starting to realise is conservation is everything really, isn't it? It's fundamentally about reusing and making the best of what we've got before we build new. And what you said about when you've got an existing building, that the embodied carbon, you're so far ahead of the curve by reusing an existing building. That was really, really interesting. And it's definitely something I'll consider even more. But I think, as Andrew said, it's convincing the client sometimes, I think. Yeah, and I don't think we've got any more questions. So I think it just falls on me to say thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you missed it right at the beginning, just so you know, we will process the video, depending how long it takes, and it will go on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again and share the link and ask any questions, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. We have another one next week, which is, I think it's next week, but it's on our website. That's to do with materials and tropical architecture. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Cheers. Bye.